All right, let's jump right in. When we think about holidays, we usually think about history, right? Commemorations of big events. But what if their real origins are way older, like written in the sky older? That's exactly what we're diving in today with the Jewish festival of Purim. We're going to uncover this incredible, ancient link it has to the cycles of the moon and the sun. So here's the big question, the mystery that really gets this whole thing started. Why on earth is Purim celebrated on the last full moon of the year? And I mean, right smack dab on the spring equinox. Think about it. That's no coincidence. The timing is so specific. And figuring out why, well, that tells us this amazing story about how ancient people even thought about time itself.
Okay, so to get to the bottom of the whole Purim puzzle, we can't just look at Purim in isolation. We've got to zoom out a bit and understand the bigger picture. We need to look at the cosmic clock that makes the entire Jewish calendar tick.
Because you see, the Jewish calendar is anything but random. It's not just a list of dates someone made up. It's this incredibly smart, sophisticated system. And its whole purpose is to sync up human life with these massive, grand cycles of the heavens and the earth. It is all about rhythm. And that rhythm, it's basically built on four main things. You've got the sun, right? That gives us the seasons. Then there's the moon, which is perfect for marking off the months. Then, of course, the seasons themselves, which, are all about the sun's journey. And the big one for an ancient society, the harvests. That was the lifeblood, the agricultural heartbeat. So these four things, the sun, the moon, the seasons, the harvests, they're basically the gears of that cosmic clock we were talking about.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. To really get a handle on how this calendar is put together, you have to understand this huge shift in human history. I'm talking about the move from being a wandering, nomadic people in the desert to becoming a settled agricultural society. Because this one change created two completely different ways of seeing the world, and that totally shaped how people looked at the sky and, you guessed it, how they marked time.
And wow, check out the difference here. If you're a desert nomad, the sun is your enemy. It's deadly. So you travel, you work at night. The moon is your friend, your guide, maybe even your god. So your calendar, it's going to be 100% lunar. But then you settle down, you start farming, and boom, everything flips on its head. Suddenly, the sun is everything. It's life itself. It brings warmth. It makes the crops grow. Day is when you work. And the seasons, which are all driven by the sun, become absolutely critical for survival. This massive change forced the calendar to evolve, to become a luno-solar system. It had to track both. And this is the crucial part. This respect, this reverence for the moon, it ran deep for those ancient nomads. Their moon god was often called Yah. That's an ancient Semitic name. And here's the mind-blowing part. You still hear this name today. Every single time someone says hallelujah, what they're literally saying is praise be to Yah. It's like a linguistic fossil, a direct echo from that ancient moon-worshipping world. Isn't that wild?
This also helps explain why Shabbat, the Sabbath, is kind of its own thing. It's unique. See, unlike most of the other big holidays, it wasn't originally connected to harvests or seasons at all. Nope, it was a purely lunar festival, a holdover from that much older nomadic calendar. To people watching the sky back then, it looked like the moon just paused in its cycle every 7 days. And that pause, that Shabbat, was a super sacred, maybe even a little anxious, time that was dedicated to their moon god.
All right, so we've got that ancient, nomadic, moon-only history in our back pocket. Now let's switch gears and look at the holidays that came later, the ones that grew out of that settled, agricultural, luni-solar worldview. And this is where a really clear pattern starts to show up. Just look at this. The pattern is so consistent, it's almost a formula. You've got Passover, boom, first full moon of spring, right when the first harvests are coming in. Then Shavuot lines up with the summer solstice for the big wheat harvest. Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, they're pegged to the fall equinox and the full moon right after, signaling the end of the final harvests. And even Hanukkah lines up with the winter solstice. You see the system here, right? All the major celestial events, your solstices, your equinoxes, your full moons, they're all mapped directly onto the agricultural year. It's a perfect grid. And that brings us all the way back to where we started, back to our original question. Now that we understand how this whole cosmic clock works, we can finally solve the mystery of Purim's timing. And here it is, the smoking gun, the key piece of the puzzle, and this comes right from the source material. Purim is deliberately timed to be, quote, the last full moon of the year, according to the calendar of the First Temple. So see, this wasn't some random holiday tacked on at the end. It was designed to be the grand finale. So, okay, let's put all the pieces together. Purim's placement is just brilliant. It's so deliberate. First, it marks the spring equinox. That's a huge solar event, the official start of spring. Second, it lines up perfectly with the year's final full moon, the absolute peak of that last lunar cycle. So what does it do? It acts as this perfect celestial handoff, closing out the old year just before Passover comes along and kicks off the new one with the first full moon of spring. It's not just a holiday, it's the capstone of the entire cosmic system. And, this whole thing leads me to one last thought, a big one. Today, our lives are run by digital clocks, by notifications on our phones. We're totally disconnected from the sky. So it makes you wonder, what do we actually lose when we don't mark time anymore by these ancient, powerful, steady rhythms of the moon and the sun? What's lost when that connection is gone? Definitely something to think about.
Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're jumping into one of the most, wild festivals in the Jewish calendar, Purim. It's a day of celebration for sure, but it's different, really different.
So let me ask you this. What if a holiday's main rule was to break the rules? I mean, really think about that. A sacred day where everything gets flipped upside down, where being reverent means being rowdy, and seriousness gets tossed out the window for some officially approved chaos. Yeah, that's pretty much Purim in a nutshell.
Okay, so to really get our heads around Purim, we kind of have to start with what it isn't. Because, you see, this holiday is defined just as much by the rules it shatters as the traditions it holds. It's a total exception to the rule.
Here's the first big thing you need to know. Purim isn't technically a chag. That's a formal holy day. Think Yom Kippur or Passover. This is a massive deal because it means work is totally allowed. Right off the bat, that sets a completely different vibe, doesn't it?
And this contrast is really what makes Purim stand out. I mean, look at this. On one side, you've got your standard holy days. Very structured, specific rules, work is a big no-no. And then you've got Purim. It's the complete opposite. It's permissive, work is fine, and as we're about to see, the rules are basically there to be turned inside out.
So, where does all this permissiveness lead? Well, it takes us right to the heart of the celebration, which is basically a mandate for merriment, an official encouragement to just let go and embrace the joyful chaos.
Seriously, we are talking about a day where things that are forbidden the rest of the year aren't just allowed, they're encouraged. You've got things like cross-dressing, which would be a major taboo any other time. But on Purim, that's just the beginning. The rule-breaking goes way, way further.
And get this isn't just some modern party tradition. This comes straight from the Talmud, a foundational text of rabbinic Judaism. It literally says a person is obligated, not suggested, obligated, to get so drunk on wine that they can't tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. So yeah, on Purim, getting drunk isn't just okay, it's pretty much a religious requirement.
So what does this mandate for merriment actually look like in practice? Oh, it's exactly what you'd think. It explodes into this massive carnival of parades, crazy plays, and some of the boldest parody you can even imagine.
The whole thing is just a sensory explosion. We're talking elaborate parades with these grotesque masks, drunken parties and antics everywhere you look, even burning effigies of the story's villain. There are costume parades, huge feasts with special foods. It's a total break from everyday life.
And this wild spirit isn't just confined to the streets. It actually sparked this whole literary tradition of its own, A whole genre of drunken songs, comedy skits, and burlesque plays that love to poke fun at even the most serious topics.
And the absolute best example of this has to be the Purim Tractate. This thing was written back in the 14th century, and it's a full-on, detailed parody of the Talmud itself. I mean, think about that, parodying one of the most sacred and complicated texts in all of Judaism. The sages in this parody are just hilarious. Their names are Rabbi Bottle, Rabbi Flask, and Rabbi Drunk. And instead of debating complex points of Jewish law, they get into these completely ridiculous arguments, all centered around drinking, of course.
So what are they arguing about? Well, for starters, they debate whether animals also have an obligation to get drunk on Purim. And they even make the case that all the biblical heroes, we're talking Adam, Moses, the whole crew, were actually drunkards. It's just a perfect, hilarious flip of what sacred study is supposed to be.
And just to put a cherry on top, the whole tractate ends with a parody of the Passover Haggadah, the sacred book from the Passover Seder. Well, they rewrite it as the Drunkard's Night Haggadah. At this point, it's pretty clear that absolutely nothing is off limits.
Okay, so with all this talk of drinking, parody, and chaos, you might be thinking this is just a big, crazy party. And it is. But underneath all of that fun, Purim is actually anchored by a very serious, very sacred core.
And this is maybe the most important part. The chaos isn't just for the sake of chaos. It's all built around two fundamental religious obligations. These duties are non-negotiable, and they give the whole day its real structure and purpose.
So, what are they? First, everyone has to hear the reading of the Book of Esther. That's the book that tells the whole Purim story, and they have to hear it twice. Once at night and again during the day. And second, everyone has to share in a big festive meal that has to start before sunset. Those two things, they're the bedrock. All the wild fun is built right on top of that foundation.
So that brings us back to our big question, right? A day of rule breaking, of joyful chaos, but all built around this very sacred center. It really makes you wonder, what's the point of a day of sanctioned chaos? Maybe it's a reminder that you can only truly appreciate order and rules and seriousness when you get to experience their complete and totally joyful opposite.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into a real historical head-scratcher, the Jewish festival of Purim. So you probably know Purim as this super fun Jewish holiday, right? Costumes, parties, total chaos. But have you ever stopped to wonder where it actually came from? Because let me tell you, its wild character of, revelry and turning everything upside down has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
Okay, so let's get into the puzzle of Purim. This festival is different. I mean, really different. Most Jewish holidays have a certain level of solemnity or very specific rituals. Purim, it's pretty much defined by drunkenness, wild behavior, and just gleefully flipping all the usual social rules on their head.
So, where do we even start to solve this mystery? Well, our investigation kicks off in ancient Persia, which is, fittingly, the setting for the whole Purim story in the Book of Esther. And it's right there that we find our first big clue, another festival with some very interesting overlaps.
All right, clue number one is this festival called Sacaea. We know about it thanks to the historian Strabo, who wrote about it way back. He describes it as this ancient Persian New Year festival, and it all went down right around the spring equinox. Now listen to this, because this is where it gets good. The main features of Sacaea? Drunkenness and crazy behavior. A complete flip-flop of the normal rules. Slaves got to boss around their masters, adults acted like kids, the rich pretended to be poor. Sound familiar? It's basically a mirror image of Purim's traditions. Oh, and it was all in celebration of a goddess named Anahita. Definitely hang on to that name. It's going to come up again.
But wait, there's another angle. Centuries later, a scholar named Al-Biruni brings up a totally different idea. He mentions this ancient belief that the 14th and 15th of Adar, the very days of Purim, were actually considered the most disastrous days of the whole month. So what if Purim didn't start as a party at all? What if it was a ritual to fight off bad luck and flip a terrible day into a good one?
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. We're jumping to the late 19th century. This is a time when scholars are really starting to dissect these ancient texts, and the mystery of Purim's origins becomes a hot topic. I mean, it absolutely explodes, with all these brilliant minds throwing their hats in the ring, leading to this huge academic showdown.
And things got intense fast. Just look at this timeline. In a tiny 5-year window, you have 3 major scholars, each coming out with a completely different theory. One says Greece, another says Persia, and a third points straight to Mesopotamia. It's a flurry of ideas, all trying to claim the true origin story. So first up in our scholarly detective lineup, we have Heinrich Gratz. His theory? He's looking at ancient Greece. He points to a festival called Pithoigía, which was all about cracking open the new wine barrels, the pithoi, and you guessed it, a whole lot of drinking and partying. Plus, it happened on the spring full moon, just like Purim. It seems like a pretty solid lead, right? Well, there was one big snag. For this theory to really work, the names had to connect somehow. Gratz argued that the Hebrew word pern, which means lot, came from the Greek word pithoi, for barrel. But linguistically, it's a huge stretch. It just didn't sound convincing to other scholars, so that theory kind of fell apart.
Okay, so on to the next theory.
A year after Gratz, Paul de Lagarde steps in with a Persian connection. He argues that Pur doesn't come from Greek at all, but from an old Persian word, phravruti, which means immortality. He linked it to this Zoroastrian festival called Farvardinagon. But this one hits a wall even faster. For starters, Farvardinagon is a very serious, somber festival for the dead. It's not a party. And second, it's in November, so you've got the wrong vibe and the wrong time of year. It's just not a match.
And here's the real nail in the coffin for that theory. You don't even have to look that far for the answer. The Book of Esther, the actual source of the Purim story, tells you exactly what Pur means. It says right there in the text, Pur, that is, the lot. It means fate. So the book itself completely shoots down de Lagarde's idea. Back to the drawing board.
All right, this brings us to our third scholar, Heinrich Zimmern, and this is where we get a major breakthrough. He decided to look somewhere else entirely, not Greece, not even Persia, but ancient Mesopotamia, and what he found was a game changer.
So what did Zimmern find? He discovered that in Akkadian, this ancient Mesopotamian language, the word puru meant something very specific. It was the assembly of the gods. This was the big meeting where the gods would get together every new year and literally cast lots to decide the fate of every single human being for the year ahead.
And here's the key part. The word for the assembly, puru, eventually came to mean the thing that was decided at the assembly, fate or the lot. And that is a perfect match for the definition we get in the Book of Esther. Suddenly, the pieces are clicking into place.
But wait, it gets even better. This is maybe the most mind-blowing piece of evidence. Look at the names of our heroes, Mordecai and Esther. Now look at the names of the main Babylonian gods, Marduk and Ishtar. Mordecai, Marduk. Esther, Ishtar. The resemblance is just uncanny. It's all starting to connect.
And you know, this isn't just some clever idea that a 19th century scholar came up with. This connection is ancient. If you go back to the second book of Maccabees, from way back in the 2nd century BCE, they don't call the holiday Purim. They call it Mordecai Day. They're literally naming the festival after the character who sounds just like the Babylonian god Marduk.
So let's step back and put this all together. What does it all mean? Well, it means the origin of Purim isn't one simple story. It's not a straight line. It's more like a rich, tangled, and absolutely fascinating tapestry woven together from a bunch of different cultural threads.
Okay, so here's the most likely way it all went down. Step 1, you have this ancient Mesopotamian myth about the gods Marduk and Ishtar deciding everyone's fate, their Pirdu. Step 2, that story gets adapted and transformed into a Jewish narrative about national survival, with the heroes' names, Mordecai and Esther, echoing those gods. And step 3, the actual celebration borrows all the fun, chaotic, topsy-turvy party elements from local festivals that were already happening, like the Persian Sacaea.
When you really look at it, the story of Purim is an amazing example of how culture works. Things are rarely just invented out of thin air. Instead, they're this incredible blend of borrowed ideas, adapted stories, and reinterpreted traditions. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of the things we celebrate today are just a patchwork of ancient rituals that we've totally forgotten the original meaning of? All right, let's dive into a story I'm sure you know. A dramatic tale about a brave queen, her clever cousin, and a truly wicked villain. But you know, underneath that familiar surface, there's a really fascinating historical puzzle. So today, we're going to put on our detective hats and investigate the Book of Esther. Okay, so where do we even begin with this mystery? Well, let's start with the central anomaly of the book, the most glaring clue of all. There's something so strange and striking that's missing, something that makes it totally unique in the Hebrew Bible. Any guesses what that is?
That's right, God. In the entire book, the name of God is never, ever mentioned. Not once. And that isn't just a casual oversight. It's a huge detail that has stumped scholars for centuries. And it perfectly sets the stage for our investigation.
Okay, first up, the festival before the book. Now, we usually think the story of Esther is the reason for the festival of Purim. But what if we've got that completely backward? What if the party came first?
Yeah, check this out. There's actually a pretty solid consensus among scholars that the festival of Purim was already a thing long before the Book of Esther was written to explain it. Basically, the celebration was happening and the story came along later to give it an official Jewish origin. You know, in comic books and movies, we'd call this a retcon, retroactive continuity. And this theory suggests the book is this absolutely brilliant retcon that takes an older tradition, maybe one that wasn't even Jewish to begin with, and gives it this powerful new meaning, all about Jewish survival and identity.
On to our next clue. Section 2, a different persecution. For this part, we have to go to the scene of the crime, the ancient Persian city of Susa, right in the middle of a pretty chaotic time under the rule of King Xerxes.
So let's set the scene here. Scholar Robert Lippmann places this whole story smack in the middle of Xerxes' reign. And the most important thing to know about this king is that he was known for being super intolerant when it came to religion. That's a really key motive in a story about persecution, right?
And according to the research, Xerxes wasn't just intolerant, he was on a mission. He wanted to stamp out other religions, especially the Babylonian gods like Marduk and Ishtar. And it just so happens that Susa, the city where our story is set, was full of people who worship them. So the primary group feeling the heat from the king might not have been who we think.
And now for the clue that might just unlock this whole thing. And the funny part is, it's been hiding in plain sight this whole time, right there in the names of our heroes. So here's a wild idea from a scholar named Ulkus Lovey. He was a linguistics expert, and he proposed this fascinating theory. He said, what if we look way, way closer at the names Mordecai and Esther? What if they're not what they seem?
And when you do, whoa, the similarity is pretty hard to miss, isn't it? Mordecai is linguistically just a stone's throw from Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. And Esther? It's almost a perfect match for Ishtar, a major Babylonian goddess worshipped right there in Susa.
Louis' analysis goes even deeper. He suggests that certain phrases in the original Hebrew can be read in a totally different way. A phrase that translates to Esther the queen could be a direct echo of a saying that praised the goddess Ishtar. And the phrase we read as the people of Mordecai, well, it could just as easily be read as the Mardukian people, the followers of the god Marduk.
Okay, so let's just follow this trail of clues for a minute. Section 4, the story's pagan roots. If we take all this seriously, what did the original story even look like?
Well, take a look. The basic plot, persecution and survival against a powerful enemy in the king's court, it works perfectly with this new cast of characters. The threat comes from Xerxes against the worshippers of Marduk and Ishtar. The heroes are a Mardukian man and his cousin. It's the same fundamental story, just with different heroes at the center of it.
So this brings us to a really important question. Section 5. Why this origin matters. Does a theory like this somehow diminish the Book of Esther? Does it make it less important?
Not at all. In fact, you could argue it makes the book even more remarkable. This theory doesn't erase the profound meaning the story holds. Instead, it highlights the absolute genius of its author, someone who took a powerful existing narrative of survival and masterfully recontextualized it for a new audience and a new purpose.
So what this really shows us is a dynamic process. It tells us that stories can have layers of meaning, that cultures in the ancient world were constantly swapping and borrowing ideas, and that a powerful story about survival can be adapted to fit new communities. Traditions aren't set in stone, they evolve.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. This whole detective story about Esther and Mordecai, or maybe Ishtar and Marduk, it really invites us to always look a little deeper, to question where our stories come from, and to appreciate the complex, layered history behind the narratives that shape our world.
So, let's talk about the Jewish holiday of Purim, but probably not the story you're thinking of. We're going to dive into some fascinating takeaways from the work of scholar Richard Preschel, whose research suggests that Purim's origins are way, way older than we thought, and maybe they're even written in the stars.
Right, the story of Esther, Mordecai, and that villain Haman. It's a story we all know. But what if that whole narrative was written to give a new meaning to a festival that people were already celebrating for centuries? What if the real origins are hiding in plain sight, right above our heads?
So where do we even start looking for clues? Well, the first one isn't in some dusty old scroll. It's in the cosmic calendar. You have to remember, for ancient people, the sun and the moon weren't just background objects. They were the rhythm of life itself.
Okay, this right here is the absolute key. Purim is what's called a lunisolar festival, tied to both the moon and the sun. It always happens on a full moon, right around the time of the spring equinox. Now to us, with our phones and digital calendars, that might just seem like a neat coincidence. But for the ancients, this alignment was a massive cosmic event. It was a huge deal. And it turns out, Purim was in good company. I mean, look at this. Across the ancient world, the spring equinox was party time. You had the Greek Pithoigía, the Persian Sacaea, even the modern Iranian New Year, Nowruz. And they all share the exact same timing and the same vibe. Big feasts, lots of celebrating, and yeah, a bit of chaos. This strongly suggests that Purim was part of a much bigger, widespread cultural tradition.
So if the timing and the traditions were all shared, what about the story itself? Well, this is where things get really wild, because it looks like some of the characters in our story might just be gods in disguise.
Okay, get ready for this, because this is the moment where it all starts to click. According to Breschel's research, the names in the Book of Esther are almost identical to the names of major gods in the Babylonian and Elamite pantheons. Mordecai and Esther sound an awful lot like Marduk and Ishtar, the top gods of Babylon. And their enemies, Haman and Vashti, their names sound just like Uman and Mashti, who were deities of the rival Elamites. I mean, come on, that just can't be a coincidence.
And this mythological battle, it fit the season perfectly. The spring equinox is that moment when the days finally start getting longer than the nights. It's a powerful symbol for the victory of light over darkness, of order over chaos. And in the Babylonian creation story, that's exactly what happens. Their main god, Marduk, defeats Tiamat, the goddess of chaos. The Purim story basically mirrors this exact cosmic struggle.
You know, this human need for a moment of release, for a little bit of sanctioned chaos to celebrate the return of order, it actually has a name. Anthropologists call it liminality. It's that in-between state, that moment on the threshold where all the normal rules of society just go out the window for a little while. And it seems to be a universal human thing.
And hey, this isn't some ancient, dusty concept. You see it playing out all around us today. Just think about the incredible energy of Carnival in Rio or Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Heck, even that feeling during a New Year's Eve countdown. Those are all liminal moments, times for revelry and rule-breaking that echo that exact same ancient impulse we see in Purim.
Okay, so this brings us to the big question, right? If Purim has this deep roots in a really popular, widespread folk festival that's tied to pagan myths, how in the world did it become one of the most beloved Jewish holidays? How did that story get transformed?
Well, here's how that transformation probably went down. First, you get this popular folk festival that everybody's already celebrating, and that festival's connected to this old myth about a battle between Babylonian and Elamite gods. So then, the Book of Esther is written, and it's brilliant. It takes that existing structure and completely reframes it, masterfully turning these pagan gods into Jewish heroes and Persian villains. It gives the old festival a brand new and uniquely Jewish meaning.
Now, this whole theory also gives us a fantastic answer to one of the biggest puzzles in the entire Bible. Have you ever wondered why the Book of Esther is the one book where God's name is never mentioned, not even once?
And here's the stunningly simple answer. The authors of the text were working with a story where the main characters were just barely disguised versions of pagan gods. They simply could not place the name of the one unique God of Israel into a story that was still echoing with the names Ishtar, Marduk, and Uman. The absence of God's name wasn't some mistake. It was a deliberate, and you could say, a necessary choice.
So that brings us to one last really big question. Why did this holiday, with its chaotic, folk-based, not-so-Jewish roots, why did it not only survive, but become so incredibly central to Jewish tradition?
Listen to this. This quote from the ancient rabbis is just extraordinary. It says that in the future Messianic age, all the other holidays will be canceled, but Purim will not be. It says Purim is an eternal festival, right up there with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So think about that. The most solemn, serious day of the year and the most rowdy, chaotic day of the year. Those are the two that are said to last forever.
And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Why would a holiday that celebrates chaos, that's all about turning things upside down, and has its roots in these ancient cosmic battles, why would that be considered one of the most essential and eternal holidays? Maybe it tells us something really profound about the human need for both order and chaos, for reverence and for revelry, and for a story that connects us all to the oldest rhythms of the universe itself.